Philip, then I'll. Okay, welcome to Sessions of Spirit number 21, Ideal Philosophers. Hello, hello. If you're just joining the series now, I'm going to start sharing my screen and doing a recap. Oh, actually, Philip, you actually have to do the sharing of the screen. Here's the notes. I'll just put them in the chat. Let me quickly figure this out. We're changing things so quickly with every session because we're sublating as we go along. And for the philosophers that have been with us to this point, you know exactly what I mean when I say sublation. So I'll put the notes in the chats. And Philip, if you just open those, and anybody else who's following along, you can just open them. And if you're on YouTube, there's a live stream going. There's actually 3 live streams going. There's one on Discord, there's one on YouTube, and then there's one on Facebook. The goal is to make these go universal and potentially reach critical mass by session 38, or even in the second cycle, if we teach one. So I'll just do my quick little recap. And I'm not sure if you know how to share your screen, Michael, but you can kind of open the notes and then just start sharing them. Or you can make me the host again and I can kind of wing it.
It's Philip doing the hosting right now. And maybe you can just start your review while he gets the screen share figured out, because we don't really need the document to understand that.
Yeah, sometimes people might want to follow along, but oh, there we go. Okay, so you can see in front of you now that we do a quick recap for anybody new so you get some context of how we got to where we are. So I will do this in 2 minutes. That's my goal. As the sessions get longer, it gets to be more of an art. But I will try and keep it within the time limit. So, okay. So in session 1, we talked about Hegel being the greatest philosopher because he summed up 3,000 years of philosophers. And for 200 years, session 2 was about nobody understanding that concreteness he had. Number 3 was once you do understand it, it releases your spirit to change the world. Number 4 is that you get beyond the stereotypes of Hegel and you grasp the first negation as only the first negation, and it leads you to the more modern second negation. The 5th session was about starting Hegel properly in his true beginning and then ending up in this like circle of reason. The 6th session was about at the end of the circle of reason, you sublate religion, you don't just negate it. The 7th session is when you do that, you grasp the universal logic, which is how we're going to win the Nobel Peace Prize, to actualize that practical spirit. Number 8 is that the logic, this universal logic, begins with polemics. But number 9 is that the truth of polemics is sublation as genuine refutation or the negation of that negation, polemic of polemics. Number 10 was about the science of logic being Hegel's masterclass in continuous sublation. 11th was that when you grasp this masterclass, it's literally the ineffable speaking itself, profound. This 12th session was about the universal logic being the purpose of life, and grasping it is what living freedom is. The 13th session is that everybody can do this and we liberate each other. The 14th is that when you do this, you have this profound connection to God. The 15th session is that actually you don't have to call it God. You can be an atheist and you're just connecting to yourself in a profound way. The 16th session is that our gurus are doing this. Science of logic implicitly. The 17th session is that we're sublating the old mysticism to the new, genuinely philosophical mysticism as the power of now and presence. The 18th session is about the limit of your dialectical reason is the limit of your presence, the limit of your fun, the limit of your flow. The 19th is when you get really good at this, laughter becomes the ultimate polemical tool. And the 20th session is that the ideal philosopher uses this sort of laughter and ideal logic to sublate all other philosophies in the synchronicity document, and they overcome one-sidedness. So that leads to today, session 20. And if you want to open up, the 1-paragraph summary, which I actually need to open myself. I have a couple of laptops open here. But the 1-paragraph summary is about just a really quick recap of the essence of the session. So today's session is, of course, 21. I think I said 20 before, but it's 21. It's called SOS, which stands for Sessions of Spirit, but also Save Our Souls, because philosophy is also practical and it's supposed to better the world. And wisdom will do that. We're introducing a new wisdom from Hegel. The title of the session today is Evil as Ideal, and then in brackets, Ignorance. So the paragraph goes like this. Where does evil come from? Does evil truly exist? In its non-ideal form, its illusory being makes its appearance, but in truth, in the clarity of the wisdom of genuine philosophy, all is ideal. All is connected in its right order and right place, including evil itself. Is this possible? How can a loving God be so cruel? What is this cop-out of human free will? The philosopher Hegel provides a meaningful answer, the likes of which the world has never seen in such clarity and insight. When we see evil for what it is, we see that all evil comes from and originates in one-sidedness. It is possible to idealize this and overcome it in the most profound of divine and scientific logic. From demonology to mundanity of ignorance, all forms are integrated into an absolute rational totality, which returns the good as the essence of ourselves. A little bit purple prose, a little bit poetic, but it's actually scientific and logical, which we're going to unpack now in the notes. So if you want to join me there, point number one is just recapping what we did yesterday. So we talked about ideality, like the best, right? The best philosophers do something universally. And all philosophers are sort of doing this overcoming of one-sidedness or this limited abstract thinking. And the synchronicity document of philosophy is the practical manifestation of how we do that with philosophy itself. We're overcoming the one-sidedness in current philosophy itself that's keeping it fragmented and painful and not fun and not full of laughter. It's full of polemics. It's full of abstract negations. Philosophers are not working together in a living spirit of wisdom. They are using their little finite bubbles of wisdom, and then they're finding their opposite as a contradiction because everything is dialectical, and then they just negate each other because that's the second moment of logic. You can't get rid of it. That's what we talked about in Sessions of Spirit number 8, about the polemical moment being necessary, but it doesn't have to be in that that spirit of pain. It's actually just a moment of knowledge. And when it turns into a moment of knowledge, it's just a logical process of self-discovery, which can be fun and playful. But it requires you to be two-sided, truly dialectical, truly free in that living universal logic. Okay, so that's what we did yesterday. That's what ideal philosophers do. We currently don't have this document in the world, which is why we have basically the Ukraine and Russian war. We have a lot of strife, which the pandemic showed, but counterintuitively, despite how bad it seems, reason has been actualizing itself in history to this point. So history is not just an arbitrary process. Darwinian evolution, natural selection, it is actually this realm of logic coming to explicate itself through us. And we're actually, in terms of global data, in the most peaceful period in human history relative to other periods. Like when Marcus Aurelius had a pandemic to deal with in like 180 BC, their pandemic lasted for 15 years and like millions of people died. You know, it was like terrible. So we're kind of like 2 years in and things are getting better already, but our rights and there's a bunch of other things that are very concerning. So we're definitely not out of the woods yet. That's why we need wisdom more than ever. But in terms of wars, in terms of these big abstract negations, apparently we have less wars at this moment in time presently than at other times. And that's because we are implicitly embodying this sort of synchronicity document, this sort of accidental overcoming of one-sidedness. But there is still evil in the world. So there is this painful abstraction, and religion calls it evil. So a lot of people want to avoid evil because they're like, well, this isn't a term that philosophy should really be dealing with. It's kind of a religious, sensuous term. But like we said, philosophy is the fulfillment of religion. It is the sublation of it. And the synchronicity document is overcoming the one-sidedness through a spirit of continuous sublation. We're just doing the science of logic, which is what that vertical column was. It's basically the dictionary of pure thought in its essence. So we're separating the sensuousness which is where evil kind of comes in. And especially in the Christian religion, but in all religions, even Buddhism and Buddha saying that you have to address this notion of attachment. You have to have unattachment, but that doesn't mean aestheticism. You're going way too far in the dialectic, but you can't be a glutton either. You can't let your desires take hold of you and then you're not free in yourself. That's why he's talking about this middle path. But the middle path isn't just the gray area. It is the sublation. It is the transcendental moment of wisdom that he's trying to grasp, right? But he doesn't have the universal language, or he might have. It's just that in his time, thousands of years ago, if he would have talked in that rigorous logical way, nobody probably would have understood it. So that's what Hegel's doing. He's giving you that pure essence, the scientific essence in its clarity. And this is how we're going to overcome this notion of evil. But evil is really just abstract negation. It's that second moment of logic where it creates this one-sidedness that wars with itself. Okay, so then, you know, if this is what evil is in a logical sense, separation from the good. So remember, there's three moments to logic. There's the abstract understanding, which is where you have a single concept by itself, and then it negates itself into its other, its pure otherness. There's a separation. So the negative moment of reason is the separation. And then there's the negation of that moment as a return back to something affirmative. And that return is the positive moment of reason, where you kind of overcome this moment of tension, and it harmonizes the two opposites in a two-sidedness. And evil is when you stay in that separation and you don't self-recognize with the other. When you don't self-recognize with the other, what happens? They become your enemy because you don't want to be them. You don't identify with them. So it's not integrated into you. You don't know how to move with it with your knowledge and understanding. What we don't understand is what we fear. You know, I think JFK's famous quote says, "You have nothing to fear but fear itself." The fear is the unknown. And so this is where evil kind of comes from. And we're going to get into that a little bit more. But just to get into the logic of it a little bit more, how do I get out of this view? Okay, here we go. To scroll down a little bit here. But where does evil come from in the first place? I gave a couple of quotes, so we stay rigorous and we stay scholarly. I gave a quote from Hegel directly. And I'm going to read it here. I'm just trying to pull up my timer so I know how much time I have left here. Okay, 22 minutes. Okay, so I'm going to read a fair portion of these so that you understand how to read Hegel. By this point, you should have enough to start having the confidence to read him sort of directly, because there's a sort of despair that happens when you're reading him to basically overcome the evil that's inside of you. You have to read these words in the right clarity, in the philosophical clarity. So here's a quote from Hegel's Lectures on the Philosophy of Spirit regarding his conception of where evil comes from. The further point is that feeling is a determinate, restricted singular. And notice I'm underlining specific words that I want to highlight with these quotes. So singulars being highlighted because remember in the previous sessions, the notion is this universal logic that is in all things. When you grasp the truth of something, you're exploring it in its logical essentiality. And that happens through the elements of the notion. The notion has three elements. It has the universal as the first element. The second element is the particular. And the third moment is individuality. And then if you grasp something truly, you grasp it in all three of those modes. If you're missing one of those modes, you probably don't have the truth, the full truth of a concept. So here we see Hegel beginning to explain evil, starting with these elements of the notion. And he's going to use another one as we read on further. So feeling is singular. From this, and singular means individuality. So from this, we know that feeling is capable of having any possible content, and that this content can be good or evil. Feeling has no criterion in itself because it is this feeling of a human being. So what he's saying here is that feeling is an early stage. So everything grows in Hegel, right? If you don't show the growth, it's not living. It's not living logic. If you think of it in these abstract bunches up, it's holding things sort of in an evil combination. It's abstract human knowledge. It's maybe what religion would call sinful knowledge. In terms of modern science, atheism, it's just siloed knowledge. And often when you have disciplines focused in this way, they war with each other when they should be one total science, right? So feeling is sort of the beginning stages of this growth of knowledge. It's an early stage. And we like to think as mystics and as religious faith, they have it kind of backwards. They're saying, no, you can only know the unknown through feeling. So it's pointless to try and actually explicate it as thought and reason. But Hegel is saying here, right in the paragraph, no, you have to start with feeling. And feeling has no criterion of truth in itself. It's not thinking, right? It's not explicit thought. So it doesn't have a criterion to analyze itself as good or bad. Good or bad is a thinking process. Feeling is how you're sort of enmeshed with the totality of the world, just as it is, implicitly. So you are sort of, this is what animals are kind of doing, right? Which we'll get to in a second. So notice here, he's going to move on from this initial state to the next moment of the notion. So he says, what is universal? So that's an element of the notion, right? What is universal? That is for the human being the measure. What is universal? That is for the human being the measure of something. So what he's trying to say is the singular is the opposite, in a sense, to the universal. So logically, feeling comes first, but it's not measuring things. It's not measuring good and evil. That comes with the other element of the notion, the universal. The universal is how reason starts to happen, and it's how you actually measure something. But feeling is, to continue on, but feeling is merely singular and can contain in itself either good or evil. The universal has its basis in thought. This can be also felt. It is mine, and so my immediate feeling, but it derives from spirit. And remember, spirit is this explicit true thinking, this universal thinking to itself. It rises above this immediacy, which is what feeling is. Remember, the first moment of logic is always immediate. The second moment is mediation, and the third moment is immediate mediation or mediated immediacy. So whenever you see that word immediate, it always kind of comes with this feeling of beginningness, because we're always in this living mode of logic. So spirit is this breaking out of immediacy and making the criterion of good and evil explicit to itself. In the animal, whatever it needs, whatever is good for it, exists in the mode of feeling as instinct. But the human being has no instinct. Its instinct is reason. Thinking here is not at all to be understood as philosophical thinking. Thought in the pure element of thinking, it would be followed to demand that here. One knows a basic principle and it derives from spirit. The good can be present in feeling, but the only criterion of good is rationality. So the true must have the form of universality. So what he's saying here is that when you're growing, when you're becoming a genuine philosopher, even thinking itself starts growing. Like even explicit thought, once it starts to separate itself from the immediacy of feeling, it itself is just another beginning. So once you start explicating the thoughts to criterion as a pure thought, as your conscious self-thinking, you're breaking out of animal thinking, the particularities, and you're getting to this universal thinking. But even this beginning universal thinking is just, it's just ordinary thinking, pictorial thinking, Hegel calls it. That itself has to also evolve into true philosophical thinking, which is where you grasp pure thought, not in its like semi-sensuousness, you grasp it in its pure scientific form, which is where the system ends up. That's what it's trying to do. It's trying to kind of take the sensuousness, the immediacy of nature, and it's trying to separate it a little bit. So that's why it sounds contradictory. He's saying, well, you need to be thinking, but here he's saying it's not philosophical thinking. It's folly. But what he's saying here, there's two types of thinking. The good can be present in feeling, but the only criterion of good is rationality. The true must have the form of universality. So that's that self-reflexivity, the universal for the universal, which is what the pure I is. Concerning experience, it is known that animals do not have religion. However, it is through thought that feeling becomes human. So that sounds like a contradiction in a certain sense, right? Through thought, feeling becomes human. You have to take feeling, which we often put as a juxtaposition or as an opposite to thought. You have feeling in its purity, and then you have thought as opposite to it. You don't really mix them, right? But that's exactly what Hegel says real rationality is. Real goodness is not just this dry, dead logic, but it's also not this sheer unthinking immediacy. Real rationality is what he calls not just reason, he calls it genuine reason. That qualifier, that genuine word, is what is separating us from the ordinary understanding of the opposites. And it allows you to sublate them and bring them into a concrete unity, which has the opposition and the clarity between them. So they are distinct. They do exist in their pure abstract forms, but we're not holding them in that one-sidedness anymore. We're actually holding them in their two-sidedness as belonging to each other. That when you separate them, you end up in this sort of like unclear thinking, which religion was calling evil. When you think unclearly, you do bad things. So he's basically saying this is how bad feelings come into the heart. This is how we start becoming evil if you act from this place of abstraction where you're not actualizing this pure thought to the philosophical level. If you're keeping it in the abstract form of thought or in the abstract form of feeling, you fall into that one-sidedness. So this is how evil comes through human beings as we're breaking out of nature as thinking creatures. And at first, our thinking isn't very clear. So that's why there's a lot of brutality, what Hegel calls the slaughter bench of history, where there's a bunch of sacrifices that are being made as world spirit comes through us to actualize itself. So there's a second quote here. I hope that makes more sense. If you read that without the context, it might not make a lot of sense because there's a lot of contradictions in there. But the second paragraph is just emphasizing that it's just the beginning. So in feeling, he says, everything exists, everything that becomes representation, concept, etc. And then he says, see, this word representation is kind of important because when you first start breaking out of sensuousness, that immediacy of feeling, nature just driving itself, when you first start breaking out of it, you don't just grasp pure thought right away. Sensuousness is sticky. It sticks to the pure thoughts because we're these creatures, we're these finite creatures. And that stickiness, when pure thought is starting to explicate itself as consciousness, there is a beginning separation, but the sensuousness is still sticking to it. And we call this like the moment of representation. The second moment of logic, remember there's 1, 2, 3. The second moment of logic is the moment of representation. So that word representation is kind of important here because he's saying it's coming, we have feeling, and then it's what's coming immediately after feeling before we get to pure thought, before we get to pure philosophical thinking. So then he gives a weird quote here. And the reason why I kind of put this in here is so you can grasp something that is not common even to Hegelian scholars. And I hope that my interpretation is correct, and I think it is. But this quote comes from his aesthetics. He's talking about art here because art is also the beginning. Art is what we have in this, we're trying to grasp the pure thoughts in like hypersensuousness. And then the next moment of representation is religion. So we're taking the science of logic right now, and we're lining it up with the logic that comes way later in the philosophy of spirit, in the encyclopedia. But it's just the same logic moving. So this quote comes from aesthetics, it comes from art, but Hegel means it in a kind of profound way. He means it in a philosophical way. So he's saying, oh man, out of thine own passions and feelings thou hast created thy gods. Why is he putting this quote here? He says, the entire matter is here, but it does not yet possess the proper form. The infinite form is knowledge, and knowledge in its truth is rational knowledge. This content which spirit possesses in itself belongs in principle to reason and has reason as its root, but it does not yet have rational form. Herein lies the possibility that the content of the heart may also be evil or bad. It becomes evil through the restriction, through some sort of one-sidedness that is established, that it establishes. So here Hegel is making it explicit. This is not me filling this in. This is where I got it from. So now if you go and talk to scholars and they're like, no, this is not what Hegel says is evil. Read the philosophy of religion. It's about God and all this extra stuff. No, logically, it's really just about one-sidedness. And here's the proof right here. Why is he mentioning the gods then? Why is he putting this kind of artistic quote in here? It's because the gods he's talking about here are the categories of pure thought in the logic. Because remember, the categories are the ineffable speaking itself. They're eternal. So when you're stuck in sensuousness, when you're stuck in the artistic mode or the religious mode, you're creating the gods in your image. you're not realizing that you're in the image of God, which is that you're taking for granted your own thoughts. And that's why you can't break out of the sensuousness, because you can only grasp the supersensuous pure thoughts, these godly forms, through imperfect forms, through particular instances in your life, and you're sort of pattern recognizing. So he's basically saying here that if you don't break out of this immediacy, this beginning way of thinking, you create these gods that are contingent. They're a part of your sensuousness, and you need to purify them in their true godliness or their eternal universal logic. And if you don't do that, you restrict those gods in your form. You create the one-sidedness. I hope that makes a little bit more sense. There's very few people that will interpret it that way, but I think that is the proper way to interpret that quote. He's really just talking about the science of logic here. We're returning to pure thought. Remember, the science of logic is pure thought thinking itself. So that's why he's mentioning that once you get out of this immediacy, where you end up beyond one-sidedness is not gods in your own image, but gods in themselves, the pure thoughts thinking themselves in the realm of pure thought. Okay. I hope that makes sense to you. But why this godhood? You know, what is the ultimate evil? What is the ultimate one-sidedness? This part I hope will be profound to you. Sorry about that. Okay. What is religion trying to get at when it's talking about evil then? Like, where we know it's coming through human beings, but where's the root of this logic starting from? You know? Well, it starts with radical freedom. And so this is not your grandma's freedom. This is like radical, ontological, epistemological, really existing freedom. So the dialectic between free will and determinism has been a raging debate between theists and atheists for a long time, between just genuine philosophers trying to tease out whether everything is determined through necessity, because we have laws in the universe, or whether it's we have some kind of freedom from that. In Hegel's Encyclopedia of the Philosophical Sciences, he makes this clear. He says, you begin with logic, which is the science of logic. So if you see this first opposite here, you start with the supersensuous, and you get all the categories of pure thought, this pantheon of eternal gods. That's where they exist, is in this moment here. But then what happens is the logic perfects itself, Hegel says. It turns into the absolute idea. And of its own necessity, it's perfect reason thinking itself. It's like perfect destiny. It is simultaneously creating itself as it's discovering itself. It ends up completing itself as this radical idea that has to free itself from itself as a logical necessity. The moment of freedom comes in, where it negates itself into what it's not. That's what nature is. It radically frees itself into this other being. And this other being is the being of nature. Okay, so because the logic is perfect reason, nature is the opposite. It's like perfect irrationality, almost randomness, chaos. The pure being of nature is radical contingency. And this is where religion is trying, or at least Christian religion is trying to bring in this idea of evil is natural. So when Adam and Eve ate from the tree of knowledge, they started gaining the sinful knowledge that was very sensuous in nature. And then it talks about childbirth and all this kind of stuff. It's kind of talking about this division. But surprise, guess what? There's a sublation coming. This opposition, this one-sidedness between logic and nature, this is sort of the ultimate one-sidedness. This is the highest level of one-sidedness you can grasp, where these two are warring with each other. But the reality is that spirit is the sublation of these two. It has both of them inside of itself. So the atheist loves to talk about how, okay, if there's an all-loving God, it can't have evil inside of it, because if it's all-knowing, it would prevent badness from happening because it's all good. So there's a logical contradiction there. But what the atheist is talking about is it's talking about this version of God. Hegel says that spirit is God coming to know itself. It's returning to itself from an externality. That externality is nature. So you're returning to the logic as spirit, grasping the pure logical categories, the God thinking, the God categories. You're grasping them as immanent in yourself, and you're making them explicit to yourself. So it's like God returning to itself, but it has this moment of evil in it, this moment of separation and one-sidedness that is nature. but it also has the good in it. So when theists are negating atheists, they're not talking about this one as the all-knowing goodness. In a way, the completed form of spirit is the overcoming of the radical irrationality. Because remember, the good is rational. This is what the theists are talking about. They're saying, oh, okay, in the science of logic, those categories are perfect. Like that's perfect logic. It's perfect science if you want to look at it atheistically. So here's where we don't have explicit knowledge though. It's immediacy. So to get the best of both worlds, spirit is growing into higher and higher levels. And it only achieves this like universal peace, this blessedness, this overcoming of one-sidedness, this overcoming of evil at very high levels of rationality that begin to approximate the logic. So that's why theists think it's a return to God, because we're returning to true scientific thinking. And with true scientific thinking, the irrationality of nature is overcome and the world makes sense. And when the world makes clear sense to you, you operate in it through a mode of wisdom. And when you move in the world with wisdom, it becomes a lot less harsh, right? It becomes a harmony because you see it in its truth. So this is how you start idealizing evil. Evil is really just ignorance. And in the last couple of moments, you can read these paragraphs for yourself. But here's a direct quote from Hegel saying, well, if evil has its place in this circle of reason as nature, it's an unalienable moment. You can't get rid of it, but you can transform the nature of it. The slaughter bench of history becomes more and more blessed over time, but it only does that when spirit grasps itself as reason, the truth, the universals behind the appearance of the irrationality of nature. It's just your own confusion. It's what Hegel calls theoretical spirit. When pure thought is emerging from feeling, at first it's just what he calls theoretical spirit. But the opposite of theoretical spirit is practical spirit. Those are the two one-sided modes of thinking. The sublation of those two is free spirit. That's the living logic coming through you explicitly as a philosopher. So you start with this faith that the world is rational, which we covered earlier. It helps you to want to strive for this level of spirit, this level of thinking, this wisdom, that you can actually achieve it, that the world is determinate. So I highlighted this word determinate because now you know it's a loaded word. It's what 3,000 years of philosophers were missing in terms of their concept of the good. Hegel is filling it out with the science of logic. Those are the ultimate eternal determinations. He's not leaving it indeterminate like Plato or the scholastics or Kant with the thing in itself. Those are indeterminacies. Those are beyond you can never know. But that's just the irrationality of nature. They're making a mistake. They're confusing the nature of the being of nature for the being of the science of logic. But he's saying spirit actually takes from that irrationality, that being of nature, it starts to separate itself while staying sensuous, while staying finite. It starts to grasp that science of logic purely in its purely determinate mode. That means you can know it because it's immanent in you, because the parts are in the whole and the whole are in the parts. You are connected to it immanently. That's what Protestantism was trying to grasp with Martin Luther, but they couldn't break out of the sensuous mode. They couldn't, contradictorily or ironically, they couldn't separate, they couldn't grasp the science of logic because they couldn't get rid of that carnality, right? They couldn't get rid of the drives and the sensuousness that kept them in that sort of artistic mode. And that's what philosophy sublates. That's how we grasp pure thought. So really he says, this theoretical spirit in its one-sidedness is what ignorance is. So when you idealize this moment of separation, this evil moment, it transforms into what it really is in truth, which is just ignorance. You're not grasping the true speculative nature, the true infinite concrete connectedness of everything as one science. There's one universal logic of which all separation, all diversity, all beings that look separate from each other are inwardly connected. And you are connected to that as well. So it's actually not an external thing for you. Science is not just something you do. It's actually what you are. When you really grasp the inner necessity of things, you grasp yourself as part of it. And the last quote is about how this turns into ethical life. This is how we overcome an evil sort of collective existence, and we start achieving state laws, which you can resonate with as reasonable. And when you grasp it as reason, you grasp the true universality of goodness, because you're returning to the science of logic. That's why the rational state is the ideal state, Hegel says. So I give you a couple of quotes there. If you want to join this ideal state, we are creating it as New World Spirit. If you want to go to the Facebook group, Hegelians Want to Change the World. Or you can take the wisdom quiz to see where your one-sidedness is. If you want to see the level quote unquote evil, which is really just your level of ignorance philosophically, take the quiz and we can meet you where you are and bring the ideal out of you. So join me in the chat after this. I hope you enjoyed, and we'll see you in the next one. Keep sublating, ideal philosophers.
Is this meeting over?
Yes, it'll end in a minute here, but I will restart it and we can discuss. If you want to just click on the link again in a second.
You have to click on the same link again?
Yeah, I'm going to restart it here.
Actually, someone posted another link on the meetup.
Michael did, right? I tried coming
Not
in
Michael.
through the...
No, it was I forget her name, the lady.
Oh, you mean Cynthia?
Cynthia posted her link on the meetup page. So I'm just telling Mark.
Oh, sorry. Yes. Okay. If she did that, then she's good for it. Then yeah, go to the Cynthia link. Sounds good, guys. We're figuring it out. Practical spirit all over the place. So we're living this. We're not just talking, right? So thanks for helping us work out the bugs and having patience. I'll see you in there. I'll end it now. Yep. Philip, thank you for being a host. You are an amazing man. Thank you. See you in there.